Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Cold Fire. From Marcus Chen. The dashboard of my Kenworth W900 had always run hot, especially during those long summer hauls through the Nevada desert. But that October night on Interstate 80, something had changed in a way that made my skin crawl with unease. The familiar orange glow of the instrument panel seemed dimmer somehow, casting strange shadows across the cab that danced and flickered like candlelight in a draft. And when I reached out to adjust the radio volume, the plastic felt cold enough to burn my fingertips with its unnatural chill. I had been driving for Consolidated Freight for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to produce across the western states. And in all that time, I thought I had seen everything the road could throw at a man. Strange weather, stranger people, mechanical failures in the middle of nowhere, and those long stretches of highway where exhaustion played tricks on your mind and made you see things that weren't really there. But this felt different, more substantial than mere fatigue-induced hallucinations. And as the miles rolled beneath my 18 wheels, that cold sensation from the dashboard began to spread through the entire cab like frost creeping across a window. The temperature gauge showed normal operating levels just as it always had, but the needle seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart, moving in tiny increments that should have been impossible given the steady rhythm of the diesel engine beneath the hood. The speedometer held steady at 70 miles per hour, yet the numbers appeared to shimmer and blur at the edges, as though viewed through heat waves rising from summer asphalt, even though the October air outside was crisp and cool with the promise of an early winter. My CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, warnings about speed traps and weather conditions ahead, but their voices seemed to come from very far away, muffled and distorted as though traveling through deep water or thick fog. When I keyed the microphone to respond to a question about traffic conditions, my own voice sounded strange in the confined space of the cab, echoing in ways that defied the acoustics of the familiar interior, and the other drivers seemed unable to hear my responses, continuing their conversations as though I had never spoken at all. The heater controls became almost too cold to touch, the metal feeling like ice against my skin even though they continued to blow warm air throughout the cab. And I found myself wondering if perhaps there was an electrical problem developing in the truck's wiring system. But the alternator gauge showed a steady charge, the battery voltage remained normal, and all the warning lights stayed dark and inactive on their cold dashboard panel that seemed to grow more frigid with each passing mile of dark highway. Outside the windshield, the familiar landscape of the Nevada desert stretched away into darkness, illuminated only by the cold sweep of my headlights and the occasional glow of oncoming traffic in the distance. The stars overhead seemed unusually bright and close, as though the atmosphere itself had become thinner, and I could see my breath beginning to form small clouds in the increasingly cold air of the cab despite the heater running at full capacity. That was when I noticed the ice beginning to form along the edges of the dashboard, creeping outward from the instrument panel in delicate crystalline patterns that caught and reflected the dim glow of the gauges in prismatic rainbows of cold light. At first I thought perhaps the air conditioning system had malfunctioned somehow, but the controls showed the heater operating normally, and the vents continued to blow warm air that seemed to have no effect on the spreading frost that now covered nearly half of the dashboard surface. The steering wheel grew numb in my hands, the cold seeping through the worn leather covering and into my palms and fingers, until I had to constantly flex them to maintain proper circulation and control of the massive truck. The gear shift felt like a rod of frozen metal, and the seat adjustments had become so cold that touching them sent sharp pains shooting up my arms like electric shocks, though I knew the truck's 12-volt electrical system could never generate enough power to cause such sensations. My logbook, sitting in its usual place on the passenger seat, had begun to curl at the edges as moisture in the air condensed and froze upon its pages, and when I reached across to check my hours of service, the paper felt brittle and fragile, as though it might shatter at the slightest touch. The pen I used to record my mileage and fuel stops had become so cold that it stuck to my fingers momentarily when I tried to pick it up, leaving behind tiny patches of skin that stung with the peculiar pain of frostbite. The windshield wipers, which I had not needed to use on this clear October night, began to move on their own, sweeping back and forth across the glass in slow, hypnotic arcs that cleared away frost I had not seen forming there. Each pass revealed the road ahead for a moment before the condensation returned, thicker than before, building up in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though some intelligence guided their formation into shapes that suggested symbols or letters from an unfamiliar alphabet. My reflection in the driver's side window appeared pale and distorted, the features blurred and indistinct, and when I turned to look directly at the glass, I could see my breath fogging the surface, despite the fact that the temperature gauge still read normal, and the heater continued to blow air that felt warm when it reached my face, though it seemed to lose all thermal energy the moment it touched any surface within the cab. The radio began to fade in and out, picking up stations that should have been well beyond its range, broadcasts in languages I did not recognize, and what sounded like old emergency transmissions from decades past, the voices crackling with static and desperation as they reported accidents and breakdowns on highways that might no longer exist. Between these phantom signals I could hear something that might have been music, though it played in keys and rhythms that seemed designed for ears other than human, melodies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. The cold from the dashboard had now spread throughout the entire cab, covering every surface with a thin layer of ice that grew thicker by the minute, and I realized with growing alarm that I was beginning to lose feeling in my extremities despite my heavy jacket and insulated boots. The truck's engine continued to run smoothly, maintaining highway speed without any loss of power, but the cabin had become like the interior of a freezer, and frost was beginning to form on the inside of all the windows, limiting my visibility of the road ahead. When I tried to pull over at the next truck stop, pressing firmly on the brake pedal, nothing happened, and the truck continued its steady progress down the interstate as though it had developed a will of its own. The steering wheel would no longer turn in my hands, locked in position by what felt like ice forming in the steering mechanism itself, and I began to understand that I was no longer in control of the 70-foot combination vehicle that had been my livelihood and companion for so many years. The speedometer needle began to move faster, climbing past 80, then 90 miles per hour, while the engine sound remained exactly the same, that familiar diesel rumble that should have changed pitch and intensity with the increased speed, but somehow did not. The other gauges started to fluctuate wildly, their needles dancing across their faces in patterns that hurt to watch, and the entire dashboard began to emit a pale blue light that provided illumination, but no warmth whatsoever, casting everything in the cab in an otherworldly glow that made my own hands look like those of a corpse. As dawn approached and I saw the first hints of gray light on the eastern horizon, the cold suddenly began to recede as mysteriously as it had arrived, the ice melting away from the dashboard and windows, the steering wheel regaining its normal temperature and responsiveness. I was able to guide the truck to a rest area where I sat for a long time, engine idling, trying to understand what had happened during those hours of supernatural cold that had transformed my familiar cab into something alien and threatening. But even now, months later, on certain nights when the temperature drops and the stars seem closer than they should, I notice the first hints of frost beginning to form again along the edges of my dashboard, and I wonder if that cold fire is merely sleeping. waiting for the right conditions to awaken and claim not just my truck, but perhaps something far more essential than mere metal and machinery. The frequency pattern. From Marcus, the CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted the frequency dial, searching for any trucker chatter to break the monotony of this endless Nevada stretch. My Peterbilt's headlights carved through the desert darkness ahead, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional tumble of sagebrush across the highway. It was just past 2 a.m, and I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Phoenix. The coffee had worn off an hour ago, leaving me with that familiar heavy-lidded feeling that every long-haul driver knows too well. That's when I first noticed the streetlights behaving strangely. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. The lights along this particular stretch of highway seemed to flicker in an odd rhythm as I passed beneath them. Not the usual random flicker of aging bulbs or power fluctuations, but something more deliberate. 3 quick flashes followed by 2 long ones, then 3 quick again. Like Morse code, but I couldn't quite place the pattern. I rubbed my eyes and checked the fuel gauge. Still had plenty to make it to the next truck stop, but maybe I should consider pulling over for a power nap. The desert wind buffeted the trailer behind me, and I could hear the gentle creaking of the cargo straps through the cab's insulation. The engine hummed its steady diesel melody, a sound that usually comforted me during these late-night hauls, but tonight it seemed to amplify the isolation of this empty highway. The next streetlight did the same thing. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. SOS. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill ran down my spine despite the cab's warmth. Someone was crying for help, but how were they controlling the streetlights? I reached for the CB radio and switched to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Breaker 19, this is Desert Eagle eastbound on Highway 95, mile marker 214. Anyone else seeing these lights acting funny out here? I waited, listening to the static pop and hiss through the speakers. Nothing but white noise and the distant whisper of atmospheric interference. The third streetlight confirmed my suspicions. Same pattern, same timing. SOS in the International Distress Code spelled out in flickering sodium vapor. But as I passed beneath it, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The light didn't just flicker. It dimmed and brightened in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples, and the light pulsed right along with it, as if something was monitoring my vital signs from inside the electrical system itself. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever was causing this phenomenon. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 75. The desert landscape blurred past my windows, an endless expanse of scrub and sand painted silver by moonlight. But the next streetlight was already visible in the distance, and as I approached, I could see it beginning its eerie dance. This time, the pattern was different. Long, short, long, short, long. The letter N in Morse code. Then it repeated over and over until I passed beneath it and the light returned to normal. My mouth felt dry as cotton, and I reached for the thermos of coffee beside my seat with a trembling hand. The liquid was cold now, bitter and acidic, but I forced myself to drink it anyway. The CB radio suddenly burst to life, startling me so badly I nearly swerved into the shoulder. But instead of a voice, it was just static. The same static I'd been hearing all night, except now I could hear something underneath it. A rhythm, a pattern. 3 short bursts of static, 2 long ones, 3 short again. SOS. Even the radio was infected with whatever was happening to the lights. I tried tuning to different channels, but they all carried the same rhythmic interference. The static seemed to be coming from somewhere close, somewhere along this very stretch of highway. My skin crawled with the realization that I wasn't alone out here after all. Someone or something was trying to communicate, using the infrastructure itself as a medium. The next light spelled out O in Morse code. Long, long, long. The bulb flickered with such intensity that it cast wild shadows across the desert floor. shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying sagebrush. I found myself counting the flashes, memorizing the pattern despite every instinct telling me to just keep driving and not look back. SOSNO. The message was becoming clear, but I didn't want to believe it. No what, no escape? No hope? I pressed the CB handset to my lips and tried again to raise someone, anyone on the airwaves. Mayday, mayday, this is Desert Eagle on Highway 95. I'm experiencing some kind of electrical phenomenon out here. Request immediate assistance. The only response was that rhythmic static now pulsing in time with the streetlights ahead. As I approached the next one, I could see it was already flickering, spelling out a single letter over and over. Long, short, short, long. The letter P in Morse code. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel now, and the cab felt stifling despite the air conditioning running at full blast. The pattern was becoming a sentence. SOSNOP. The next light continued the message. Short, short, short. The letter S. Then the next, long, short, short. Debo SOS in OPSD. I was driving faster now, eager to complete the message and understand what was trying to communicate with me through the electrical grid. The engine strained as I pushed the fully loaded truck beyond safe speeds for this winding desert highway. But I had to know. The CB continued its static symphony, and I noticed that even the truck's dashboard lights were beginning to flicker in sequence. The fuel gauge, the speedometer illumination, even the digital clock all pulsing in that same supernatural rhythm. The message completed itself over the next several streetlights. Letter by agonizing letter. SOSN. OPSD. The plea for help made perfect sense, but the second part chilled me to the bone. No PSD. No position determining system. No GPS. I glanced at the navigation screen mounted on my dashboard and felt my heart skip a beat. The display showed nothing but a blank blue screen with the words, "Signal lost," flashing in the center. My phone, clipped to the visor above my head, showed the same thing. No cellular signal, no GPS lock, no indication of where I was or how to get anywhere else. The lights had been warning me. Someone or something had been trying to tell me that this stretch of highway existed outside the normal world, beyond the reach of satellites and cell towers. I was trapped in a technological dead zone, and the only communication possible was through the primitive electrical systems that predated modern navigation. But that realization led to an even more terrifying question. Who was sending the message? The next series of streetlights began a new sequence, and I found myself unconsciously slowing down to read them more carefully. Long, long, short. The letter G, then short, long, long, long. Wait, the message was changing, becoming more urgent. GB, get out. God bless, go back. The letters continued to spell themselves out in the flickering sodium vapor as I drove beneath each light. GETO, UTNOW. The warning hit me like a physical blow, and I immediately began looking for an exit ramp or turnaround. But this stretch of Highway 95 was notoriously straight and isolated, with no services or off-ramps for miles in either direction. The median was too wide to cross safely with a loaded trailer, and the desert beyond the guardrails looked treacherous in the darkness. That's when I noticed the lights behind me. In my side mirror, I could see the street lights I had already passed continuing to flicker in their strange patterns. But now they were all synchronized, flashing in unison like some massive electronic Morse code transmitter. The entire highway behind me pulsed with artificial light, creating a strobe effect that hurt my eyes and made the desert landscape appear to jump and dance. Ahead, the remaining streetlights began spelling out a new message, one I didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. TOOLAT. My foot found the brake pedal as panic overrode training. The air brakes hissed and the trailer swayed dangerously as I brought the rig to a stop on the shoulder of the highway. I sat there in the relative darkness between streetlights, engine idling, trying to process what was happening. The Moth Bridge. From Jake Sullivan, I've been hauling freight across this great country for near on 23 years now. And in that time, I've seen my share of strange things on the lonely stretches of asphalt that connect our forgotten corners. But there's one run I made last October that still keeps me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling of my sleeper cab while the engine idles in some truck stop parking lot. It was the night I crossed what the locals in that part of eastern Montana call the Moth Bridge, though you won't find that name on any official map or DOT routing guide. The evening started ordinary enough. I was running a load of agricultural equipment from Billings down to a farming community called Millhaven. Population maybe 800 on a good day, when everyone's in town for church. The route took me off the main interstate and onto a series of increasingly narrow state highways that wound through rolling prairie land, dotted with the occasional farmhouse or abandoned grain elevator. My rig was a 2019 Peterbilt 389 with a sleeper cab, painted deep blue with chrome that caught the last rays of sunlight as it settled behind the distant mountains. The engine hummed with that steady, reassuring rhythm that becomes like a heartbeat after years on the road. The weather had been threatening all day, with heavy gray clouds building up from the west and the kind of stillness in the air that promises a serious storm. By the time I reached the turnoff for the final stretch to Millhaven, the first fat raindrops were already spattering against my windshield. I flicked on the wipers and settled in for what I expected would be a routine run through some light weather. The GPS showed another 47 miles to my destination, most of it straight highway cutting through empty country. That's when I first noticed something odd about the landscape ahead. In the distance, maybe 10 miles out, there was what looked like a low-hanging cloud or fog bank stretched across the road. It seemed to shimmer and pulse in an unusual way, almost like it was alive. At first I figured it was just heat distortion or maybe the way the approaching storm was playing tricks with the light. But as I got closer, the phenomenon became more pronounced rather than resolving itself into something ordinary. The rain was coming down steadier now, drumming against the roof of the cab with a rhythm that almost matched the diesel engine's steady throb. I had the radio tuned to a country station out of Great Falls, but the signal was getting weaker as I moved further from civilization, fading into static that mixed with the sound of rain and road noise. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic pattern, clearing the glass just long enough for me to get glimpses of the strange cloud formation that seemed to be growing larger and denser ahead. As I crested a gentle rise in the highway, I could finally make out what was causing the disturbance. About 3 miles ahead, the road crossed a deep ravine on what appeared to be a concrete bridge, probably built back in the 50s or 60s, judging by the utilitarian design. But the entire span was engulfed in what I now realized wasn't fog at all, but an enormous swarm of moths. Millions upon millions of them, so thick they formed an undulating gray-brown cloud that completely obscured the bridge structure beneath. I eased off the accelerator and let the big rig slow down as I tried to process what I was seeing. In all my years of driving, I'd encountered plenty of unusual wildlife situations, from massive flocks of migrating birds to deer herds crossing the highway, but I'd never seen anything quite like this. The moths seemed to be moving in coordinated patterns, swirling and spiraling around the bridge like they were performing some kind of ancient dance. As I drew closer, I could make out individual insects at the edges of the swarm. They were larger than any moths I'd ever seen, with wingspans that looked to be 4 or 5 inches across. Their wings caught what little light remained in the evening sky, creating an almost iridescent shimmer that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The sound they made as they flew was barely audible over the engine noise at first, but it grew steadily louder as I approached, a soft susurrus like whispered secrets or distant prayers. I pulled the truck to a stop about a quarter mile from the bridge and sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. My delivery was scheduled for early morning, and this was the only practical route to Millhaven. The GPS showed alternate roads, but they would add hours to my trip and take me through terrain that might be treacherous in the worsening weather. Besides, there was something about the sight of all those moths that fascinated me, despite my growing unease. The rain was tapering off to a light mist, and in the relative quiet I could hear the sound the moths made more clearly. It wasn't just the flutter of wings I'd expected, but something more complex, almost musical. Individual frequencies seemed to weave together into harmonies that rose and fell like a vast inhuman choir. The sound made something deep in my chest resonate, a feeling that was part wonder and part dread. I put the truck back in gear and crept forward at maybe 10 miles per hour, hoping the swarm would part as I approached or that I could find a path through them without causing too much disruption. But as I got within a few hundred yards of the bridge, I began to notice something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The moths weren't just randomly swarming around the structure, they were covering it completely. Layer upon layer of insects clinging to every surface of the concrete and steel. More concerning was what I could see of the other vehicles that had apparently tried to cross before me. There were 3 cars and a pickup truck scattered along the approaches to the bridge, all of them abandoned and covered in moths. The insects clung to the windshields and windows so thickly that no light could penetrate, turning each vehicle into a strange, pulsating cocoon. I couldn't tell if there was anyone inside those cars, but something about their stillness suggested they'd been there for quite some time. The sound of the moths grew louder as I approached, filling the cab despite my closed windows and the steady rumble of the diesel engine. It was no longer just musical, but seemed to carry meaning, like a language I couldn't quite understand, but that spoke to something primal in my brain. I found myself leaning forward, straining to make sense of the patterns in their song, when I realized with a start that I'd been slowly pressing harder on the accelerator without meaning to. I forced myself to focus and brought the truck to another stop just at the base of the bridge approach. Up close, the sight was even more overwhelming. The moths covered every inch of visible surface, their wings creating a constantly shifting tapestry of brown and gray and amber. But it was their eyes that truly unnerved me. Thousands upon thousands of dark compound eyes that seemed to track my movement as I sat in the cab. The feeling of being watched by so many alien intelligences was almost unbearable. That's when I noticed the first moths beginning to land on my windshield. Just a few at first, settling gently on the glass and folding their oversized wings. But within moments more began to arrive. And then more until I could feel the weight of them accumulating on the truck's surfaces. The sound of their wings and the scratching of tiny claws on metal filled my ears, and the view through my windshield began to dim as more insects settled on the glass. I hit the windshield washer and wipers, hoping to clear them away, but the moths simply rode the wipers' motion like a carnival ride, some of them releasing their grip only to settle back down in new positions. Their bodies made soft thumping sounds as they struck the glass, but none of them seemed injured or deterred by the mechanical interference. If anything, the movement seemed to attract more of them. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began to climb as the moths accumulated around the truck's grill and air intake, partially blocking the airflow to the radiator. I realized with growing alarm that if I didn't move soon, the engine might overheat, leaving me stranded in the middle of whatever strange phenomenon I'd stumbled into. But moving forward meant driving blind through a swarm of creatures that showed no sign of parting to let me through. I made the decision to gun it, hoping speed and momentum would carry me across the bridge before the moths could completely disable the truck. I pressed hard on the accelerator and felt the big diesel surge forward into the swarm. The world outside disappeared completely as thousands of moths struck the windshield, their bodies creating a dense, writhing carpet that blocked out all light. The sound was incredible, a thunderous flutter mixed with the continuous impact of insect bodies against metal and glass. But somehow, impossibly, I could still sense the road beneath me. It was as if the moth's song had changed, becoming a kind of guidance system that helped me navigate through the darkness. I felt the slight rise as the truck climbed onto the bridge proper, then the subtle vibration changes that told me I was crossing the span. The Mile That Counts Backwards, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you memorize every mile marker, Every exit sign, every pothole that'll rattle your teeth loose if you hit it wrong. Interstate 287 through eastern Montana was my bread and butter, hauling grain from Billings to the processing plants near the North Dakota border. My Kenworth and I had made this run so many times I could probably do it with my eyes closed. Which is why what happened last Tuesday night still has me questioning everything I thought I knew about that stretch of road. The evening started normal enough. I'd loaded up with winter wheat just as the sun was setting behind the Beartooth Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that reminded me why I loved this job despite the loneliness. The radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, complaints about DOT inspections and jokes I'd heard 100 times before. My thermos was full of coffee that was already growing cold, and I had a bag of beef jerky that would probably last me until my next fuel stop in Miles City. The weather was crisp but clear, one of those October nights where the stars seem close enough to touch, and the moon casts everything in silver light. My headlights carved through the darkness ahead while the steady rumble of the diesel engine beneath me provided that familiar rhythm that had lulled me through thousands of miles over the years. The heater hummed softly, keeping the cab warm against the chill that was already hinting at the brutal winter to come. I was making good time, just past the little town of Forsyth when I first noticed something odd about mile marker 347. Now, I knew that marker well because it was exactly halfway between my loading point and where I usually stopped for my mandatory rest break. But as my headlights swept across it, the numbers seemed different somehow. Not wrong exactly, but like they were shifting slightly in my peripheral vision, the way heat mirages dance on summer asphalt. I shook my head and blamed it on eye strain. 15 years of night driving will play tricks on your vision, and I'd been putting in long hours lately trying to make up for some medical bills that had put a dent in my savings. The CB radio was quiet except for the occasional burst of static, and the only other traffic was the distant taillights of another truck that was slowly pulling away from me on the long, straight stretch of highway that seemed to roll on forever toward the horizon. But then I passed mile marker 346 and something cold settled in my stomach. I'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes since marker 347, which meant I should have been seeing marker 348, maybe even 349. The highway had been straight as an arrow with no exits, no construction, nothing that would have caused me to somehow turn around without realizing it. I reached for my CB handset, thinking maybe I'd raise that other driver and see if he'd noticed anything strange. But all I got was static that seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm, almost like breathing. The next marker I passed was 345, then 344. Each one appeared in my headlights exactly where it should be, perfectly normal except for the impossible fact that the numbers were going backward. My GPS showed me traveling east just like always, maintaining my steady 65 miles per hour, but according to the mile markers, I was somehow moving in the wrong direction. I pressed harder on the accelerator, telling myself that maybe I was in some kind of construction zone where they'd temporarily renumbered the markers, even though I'd driven this route just 3 days earlier and everything had been normal. The engine responded with its familiar surge of power, but the markers kept counting down. Thor 3, 342, 341. Each one passed with methodical precision, their reflective surfaces glowing briefly in my headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind me. I tried the radio again, scanning through all the channels, but found only that strange pulsing static that seemed to be growing louder, more insistent. My hands were starting to sweat despite the cool night air, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The road ahead remained perfectly straight, bordered by rolling hills and the occasional cluster of trees that stood like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky. There was no other traffic now, no other signs of life except for the steady countdown of mile markers that made no sense according to everything I knew about direction and distance. When I hit mile marker 330, I pulled over at the next wide spot and killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of diesel rumble and road noise. I climbed down from the cab and walked around the truck, checking to make sure all my lights were working properly, that nothing had come loose or broken that might explain what I was experiencing. Everything looked normal. The trailer was secure, the tires were fine, and the night air carried the familiar sense of sagebrush and distant cattle. But when I looked back down the highway, the way I'd come, I could see the distant glow of mile marker 331 in my truck's taillights, which was impossible because I'd just passed marker 330. I was definitely traveling east. The North Star was exactly where it should be, but somehow the mile markers were insisting I was going the wrong direction. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine again, deciding that the best thing to do was keep driving and try to make sense of it all later. Maybe there was some logical explanation I wasn't seeing. Some construction project or GPS malfunction that would become clear in the morning. But as I pulled back onto the highway, the markers continued their backward march. 329, 328, 327. It was at mile marker 320 that I noticed the fuel gauge. I'd started the evening with a full tank, and by my calculations, I should still have been well over 3/4 full. But the needle was sitting just above the half mark, which meant I'd somehow burned through almost half my fuel while traveling what should have been maybe 70 miles. I tapped the gauge with my finger, hoping it was just sticking, but it didn't budge. The radio static was getting worse, and occasionally I thought I could hear voices buried in the white noise, too distorted to understand, but carrying an urgency that made the hair on my arm stand up. I turned the volume down and focused on driving, watching the mile markers count down like some kind of cosmic countdown timer. 3:15, 3:14, 3:13. By the time I reached mile marker 300, I was genuinely frightened. My fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank. The clock on my dashboard was spinning forward at double speed, and the static on the radio had resolved into what sounded like dozens of voices all talking at once, just below the threshold of comprehension. The highway ahead remained stubbornly familiar, the same rolling hills and distant mountains I'd been driving past for 15 years, but everything felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Mile marker 295 appeared in my headlights, and then 294, and I realized with growing panic that I was trapped in some kind of impossible loop, where forward motion only carried me backward through space while my truck consumed fuel and time at an alarming rate. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, desperate to break free of whatever was happening, and watched the speedometer climb past 80, then 90 miles per hour. The markers began flashing past faster now, but they were still counting down. 90, 285, 280. The voices on the radio were getting clearer, and I was starting to make out individual words scattered through the static like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. Help. Lost. Can't find. Going backward. Other drivers, I realized. Other truckers who had somehow ended up on this impossible stretch of highway where the miles ran in reverse and fuel burned like time was running out. At mile marker 275, something appeared in my headlights that shouldn't have been there. Another truck, a big Peterbilt with its hazard lights flashing, parked on the shoulder with its hood up. I slowed down, every instinct telling me to stop and help. But something about the way the truck sat there, perfectly motionless and somehow too dark despite its running lights, made me keep driving. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of the license plate, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was my license plate, my truck, sitting broken down on the side of this backward highway. Even though I was still driving, still moving, still counting down the impossible miles. In my mirrors, I watched the other truck fade into the darkness, its hazard lights blinking a rhythm that matched the static pulse on my radio. That's when I knew I had to escape, no matter what it cost me. At mile marker 270, I cranked the wheel hard to the right and sent my truck crashing through the wire fence that bordered the highway. The Kenworth bucked and bounced across the rough pasture land, diesel engine roaring as I fought to maintain control. Behind me, the mile markers continued their countdown, but I was no longer bound to their backward path. The last fill-up. From Marcus Chen, the gauge needle had been kissing empty for the last 40 miles, and my old Peterbilt was running on prayers and diesel fumes when I finally spotted the glow of fuel pumps through the Nevada desert darkness. The station materialized out of the wasteland like a mirage made real, its harsh fluorescent lights cutting through the midnight air with an almost aggressive brightness that made me squint as I pulled into the lot. The place looked like it had been dropped there by accident decades ago and forgotten, all weathered concrete and rust-stained metal canopies that groaned softly in the desert wind. I'd been driving this route between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles for the better part of 15 years, and I could have sworn there hadn't been a station here before. The desert highway was long and lonely, with fuel stops few and far between, and I knew every landmark, every exit, every place where a driver could catch a break. But desperation has a way of making you grateful for small miracles, even the ones that don't quite add up. And my tank was empty enough that I wasn't about to question my good fortune. The station was eerily quiet as I climbed down from my cab, my boots crunching on gravel that seemed to glitter strangely under the fluorescent lights. There were no other vehicles in sight, no signs of life except for the steady electrical hum of the overhead lights and the distant whisper of wind across the desert floor. The building itself was a small, squat structure with darkened windows that reflected the fuel island lights like dead eyes, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside or if the place was running on some kind of automated system. The fuel pumps were old-fashioned models, the kind with mechanical dials and simple card readers that looked like they'd been installed sometime in the 80s and never updated. I slid my company credit card through the reader, expecting the usual electronic beeps and prompts, but the screen remained dark for a long moment before flickering to life with green text that seemed to pulse and swim before my eyes. The message was simple enough, just instructions to select fuel grade and begin fueling, but something about the way the letters seemed to shift and blur made me blink hard and shake my head. The diesel nozzle was heavier than it should have been, the metal cold and somehow wrong against my palm, and when I lifted it from the pump, I noticed that it had an odd, oily residue that didn't quite feel like the usual fuel station grime. The smell that wafted up from the nozzle was strange too, not the familiar petroleum odor I expected, but something sharper and more metallic, like pennies left too long in the rain or the taste you get in your mouth before lightning strikes. I inserted the nozzle into my fuel tank and squeezed the handle, listening for the familiar rush of diesel flowing through the hose, but the sound that came was different, more of a thick gurgling than the usual smooth stream. The pump's mechanical counter began spinning, but the numbers seemed to move too fast, then too slow, flickering between digits in a way that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. The smell of whatever was flowing into my tank grew stronger, that metallic odor that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils and leave a bitter taste on my tongue. As the fuel flowed, I noticed that the liquid visible in the clear sight glass of the nozzle wasn't the expected amber color of diesel fuel, but something darker and thicker, with a sheen that reminded me uncomfortably of old blood or motor oil mixed with something I couldn't identify. The flow pulsed irregularly, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, and occasionally stopping altogether for a few seconds before resuming with a wet, sucking sound that made my skin crawl. The desert around the station seemed to grow quieter as I fueled, as if even the usual night sounds of insects and distant traffic had been swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung over the place like a heavy blanket. The fluorescent lights above my head began to flicker more noticeably, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, and I found myself glancing nervously over my shoulder, even though I knew there was nothing behind me but empty desert and darkness. When the pump finally clicked off, indicating that my tank was full, I tried to remove the nozzle, but it seemed to be stuck, the metal refusing to release from my fuel tank no matter how I twisted or pulled. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, so strong that I could taste it in the back of my throat. A flavor like sucking on old coins or licking a battery terminal. My hands, when I looked down at them, were stained with something that wasn't quite fuel. Something darker and more viscous that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. I finally managed to wrench the nozzle free with a wet, tearing sound that made me gag. And as I replaced it on the pump, I noticed that the concrete around the fuel island was stained with dark patches that looked suspiciously organic, as if something had been spilled here regularly over a long period of time. The stains seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they appeared normal enough. Just old oil spills and the usual detritus of a desert fuel station. Back in my cab, I turned the key and felt a moment of relief when the engine turned over immediately. But my relief was short-lived as I realized that something was wrong with the way my Peterbilt was running. The engine note was different, rougher and more irregular than usual, with a knocking sound that suggested whatever I had put in my tank wasn't agreeing with my diesel engine. The taste of metal was still strong in my mouth, and I noticed that my hands were trembling slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. As I pulled away from the station, I glanced in my side mirror and saw that the fluorescent lights were flickering more violently now, casting the empty fuel island in a strobing, epileptic glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The building itself seemed to be shifting and blurring at the edges, as if it were somehow less solid than it had appeared when I arrived, and for a moment I wondered if the place had ever really been there at all. The highway stretched out before me, dark and empty except for the cone of light cast by my headlights, and I tried to focus on the familiar routine of long-haul driving. The gentle vibration of the road under my tires and the steady rhythm of my engine. But the knocking sound was getting worse, and I could smell that metallic odor seeping into the cab now, as if whatever was in my fuel system was somehow contaminating the air I breathed. Miles passed in a haze of growing unease, and I began to notice that my fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, the needle visibly moving even as I watched. The engine knock was becoming more pronounced, and my truck was starting to feel sluggish and unresponsive, as if it were fighting against me with every mile. The taste of metal was so strong now that I could barely swallow, and my vision seemed to be developing a strange reddish tinge around the edges. When I tried to radio for help, my CB crackled with static and interference, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, mixing with what sounded like mechanical grinding, and the distant echo of machinery. The few words I could make out weren't reassuring. Fragments about fuel that runs red and stations that exist between one moment and the next. About drivers who stop for gas and never reach their destinations. My fuel gauge hit empty just as I spotted the familiar glow of another truck stop ahead. This one clearly real and normal, with big rigs parked in orderly rows and the warm yellow light of a diner spilling across the parking lot. I coasted into the lot on fumes and momentum, my engine finally giving out just as I reached a parking space between two other trucks whose drivers were probably inside enjoying coffee and pie and normal conversation about normal things. The mechanic who looked at my engine the next morning found my fuel system completely clean, filled with perfectly normal diesel fuel that tested exactly as it should have. He couldn't explain the scoring on my injection pump or the metallic residue that had somehow etched patterns into my fuel lines, patterns that looked disturbingly organic when viewed from certain angles. The taste of metal faded from my mouth over the next few days, but it never completely disappeared, and sometimes, especially late at night on empty highways, I can still taste it on my tongue like a reminder of something I'm not supposed to remember. I've driven that stretch of Nevada highway dozens of times since then, always watching for that station that appeared when I needed it most. But I've never seen it again, and part of me hopes I never will. The Acid Sky. From Marcus Delacroix. The rain started falling just past the Louisiana border, each drop hitting my windshield with a sound like tiny hammers on glass. I'd been driving this same route for 12 years, hauling freight from Houston to Jacksonville, and I thought I knew every mile of asphalt, every truck stop, every patch of weather that could roll across the Gulf Coast. But this rain was different. It struck the glass too hard, made too sharp a sound, and left behind streaks that seemed to shimmer with an oily rainbow sheen that had nothing to do with diesel fumes. My name is Marcus Delacroix, and I've been behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379 longer than some folks have been alive. She's a beauty, forest green with chrome that catches the light just right, and her engine purrs like a contented cat when the road stretches out smooth and endless ahead. That night, though, even her familiar rumble couldn't chase away the unease that had been building in my chest since the storm clouds first appeared on the horizon, black and roiling like something hungry. The radio had been crackling with chatter from other drivers all evening, voices drifting in and out of static as we all tried to make sense of the weather reports. The meteorologists seemed confused, calling it an unusual precipitation event, using words like unprecedented and anomalous. One trucker, his voice tight with something that might have been fear, had mentioned seeing the rain eat through a billboard just outside of Beaumont, leaving holes clean through the metal like someone had taken a torch to it. I'd laughed it off then, figured he'd been driving too long without sleep, but now, watching those strange streaks slide down my windshield, his words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came when I pulled into a rest area just outside of Lake Charles. The parking lot should have been full of rigs like mine, drivers catching a few hours of sleep or grabbing coffee from the vending machines. Instead, the place was eerily empty, save for a single semi parked at the far end, its trailer doors hanging open like a mouth caught mid-scream. I pulled up under what should have been the protective overhang of the truck stop's canopy, but as I climbed down from my cab, I realized the metal roof above me was riddled with perfectly round holes, each about the size of a quarter, letting the strange rain drip through in steady, rhythmic patterns. The asphalt beneath my boots showed the same phenomenon. Wherever the rain had been falling for more than a few minutes, small circular divots marked the surface, as if the pavement was slowly being consumed by some invisible acid. I reached down to touch one of the holes, then thought better of it when I noticed the acrid smell rising from the damaged concrete, sharp and chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with vinegar. The rain continued to fall around me, and I watched in growing horror as a fresh drop landed on the hood of a nearby car, sizzling for just a moment before boring straight through the metal with a soft, wet sound that made my stomach turn. I hurried back to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs as I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the interstate. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional flash of lightning that revealed more of those impossible holes scattered across the landscape. Road signs hung in tatters, their metal faces perforated like Swiss cheese. Guardrails sagged where the rain had weakened their supports. Even the trees lining the highway bore the marks of this corrosive precipitation, their leaves brown and curling, their trunks marked with small, neat holes that wept dark sap in the pale glow of my running lights. The CB radio crackled to life as I drove, voices emerging from the static like ghosts. A woman's voice, tense and frightened, reported that the rain had eaten through the roof of her trailer somewhere near Lafayette, destroying half her cargo of electronics. A man with a thick Texas drawl described watching the storm dissolve an overpass near Baton Rouge, the concrete simply crumbling away as the acidic precipitation worked its way through the support structures. Each transmission added another layer to my growing dread, painting a picture of destruction that seemed to follow this unnatural weather system wherever it traveled. I tried to outrun it, pushing my truck harder than I had in years, but the storm seemed to move with purpose, always staying just overhead, always keeping pace no matter how fast I drove. The rain hammered against my windshield with increasing intensity, and I began to notice that even my truck wasn't entirely immune to its effects. The chrome on my mirrors had begun to dull and pit, small imperfections appearing in the metal as if it were being slowly eaten away. The paint on my hood showed similar signs of distress, the forest green finish taking on a mottled appearance that spoke of chemical damage beyond anything I'd ever seen. somewhere near the Mississippi border. My windshield began to show the first signs of compromise. What started as tiny pits in the glass slowly expanded into proper holes, perfectly round and smooth-edged, allowing the corrosive rain to drip directly onto my dashboard. Where those drops landed, the plastic began to discolor and soften, filling the cab with that same acrid smell I'd noticed back at the rest stop. I cranked up the ventilation system, but even the metal housing of the air intake showed signs of the rain's destructive power, small holes appearing in the ductwork that let in more of the toxic precipitation with each passing mile. The real terror began when I realized the rain was affecting more than just inanimate objects. Through my pitted windshield, I caught sight of a deer standing in the median strip, its body perfectly still in the unnatural downpour. As my headlights swept across it, I saw that its hide was marked with those same circular holes, dark spots that went straight through flesh and bone. The animal swayed on unsteady legs for a moment, then collapsed in a heap that the rain immediately began to work on, boring new holes through what remained with methodical precision. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my truck's engine roaring in protest as I pushed her beyond safe limits. The holes in my windshield continued to multiply and expand, creating a spider web pattern that fractured my view of the road ahead. Raindrops landed on my arms and hands, and I felt a sharp, burning sensation wherever they made contact with my skin, leaving small red marks that throbbed with each beat of my heart. I pulled on a rain jacket from behind my seat, but even that offered only temporary protection as the fabric began to show signs of the same corrosive damage. The interstate ahead began to show more serious signs of structural failure. Potholes that should have been minor inconveniences had been expanded into genuine craters by the relentless rain. Bridge overpasses sagged dangerously, their concrete supports compromised by the acidic precipitation. I watched in my mirrors as a section of highway I'd just crossed simply gave way, collapsing into the swampy ground below with a rumble I could feel through my truck's frame. The storm wasn't just destroying individual objects anymore. It was systematically taking apart the entire infrastructure of the region, dissolving the very foundations of civilization one perfectly round hole at a time. As dawn approached, the rain finally began to ease, but the damage it left behind was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. The landscape looked like it had been attacked by some vast, invisible drill, everything perforated with those neat circular holes. My truck limped into a rest area near Mobile, her engine coughing and sputtering as the corrosive moisture worked its way deeper into her systems. Steam rose from her hood where the rain had eaten through the cooling system, and I knew she wouldn't carry me much further. I climbed down from the cab on shaking legs, my clothes hanging in tatters where the rain had found its way through my improvised protection. Other trucks were pulling into the rest area, their drivers emerging with the same shell-shocked expressions I probably wore. We didn't speak much. What was there to say about something so far outside the realm of normal experience? Instead, we stood in small groups, examining the damage to our rigs and trying to process what we'd witnessed. The strange thing was, within hours of the rain stopping, the authorities arrived with explanations that felt too convenient, too prepared. They spoke of unusual atmospheric conditions, a freak chemical reaction involving industrial pollutants and storm systems. They had cleanup crews and replacement parts, official forms to fill out, and insurance adjusters who seemed remarkably well informed about the specific type of damage we'd all sustained. It felt orchestrated, as if they'd been waiting for something like this to happen. I never did make that delivery to Jacksonville. My truck was declared a total loss, too damaged by the corrosive rain to be safely repaired. The insurance payout was generous, more than generous really, enough to buy a newer rig and pretend that night had never happened. The Rhythm of Route 49. From Jake Morrison. The radio in my Peterbilt has been my companion for over 15 years of long-haul trucking, crackling through everything from desert winds to mountain storms, never once failing to fill the cab with voices and music that keep the loneliness at bay. Tonight, As I guided my rig through the rain-slicked curves of Route 49 in northern Oregon, that familiar electronic hum seemed different somehow, carrying an undertone I'd never noticed before, a subtle percussion that matched the steady thrum of my diesel engine. I'd been driving since dawn, hauling lumber from a mill outside Portland to a construction site in Boise, and the October rain had been my constant companion since crossing into the Cascade foothills. The windshield wipers beat their hypnotic rhythm while droplets traced silver paths down the glass, each one catching the amber glow of my running lights before disappearing into the darkness beyond. My CB radio chattered occasionally with the voices of other drivers, but most of the chatter had died down as midnight approached, leaving me with just the AM station I'd found an hour back, playing old country songs that seemed to drift in and out of static like ghosts. The DJ's voice was smooth and warm, the kind that belongs to small-town radio stations where the hosts know every listener by name. He'd been spinning tales between songs, talking about the history of the mountain roads, the loggers who'd carved these paths decades ago, and the truckers who still traveled them when the interstate highways became too congested, or when the cargo demanded a more direct route through the wilderness. There was something comforting about his stories, the way he painted pictures of the past that made the present feel less isolated, less vulnerable to the tricks that darkness and fatigue could play on a driver's mind. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something peculiar about the music itself. Beneath each song, whether it was Hank Williams or Patsy Cline, there was a rhythmic knocking sound so faint at first that I attributed it to engine noise bleeding through the radio speakers. It wasn't unpleasant, just persistent, like someone tapping gently on wood with their knuckles in perfect time with whatever melody was playing. The beat was hypnotic, almost therapeutic, and I found myself unconsciously nodding along as I navigated the winding mountain road. The rain intensified as I climbed higher into the mountains, and the radio signal began to fade in and out, causing the DJ's voice to become fragmented and distant. During these moments of static, however, the knocking sound became clearer, more pronounced, as if the interference was somehow filtering out everything except that strange percussion. I adjusted the antenna and fine-tuned the frequency, but nothing seemed to eliminate the sound completely. If anything, my attempts to clarify the signal only made the knocking more prominent, until it began to sound less like background noise and more like an intentional part of each broadcast. The DJ returned after a particularly long stretch of static, his voice now carrying a slightly different quality, as if he were speaking from farther away or through some kind of filter that made his words seem to echo in a space much larger than a radio booth. He began telling a story about the old logging camps that used to dot these mountains, places where men would work for months at a time, cutting timber that would eventually become the houses and buildings of growing western towns. These camps were rough, isolated places where accidents were common, and medical help was days away by horseback or wagon. According to the DJ, there was one particular camp, established in 1923 near what is now Route 49, where a terrible accident occurred during the winter of 1924. A support beam in the main bunkhouse had been weakened by rot, and during a heavy snowstorm, the entire structure collapsed, trapping 17 men beneath tons of timber and debris. The rescue efforts went on for days, with survivors and men from neighboring camps digging frantically through the wreckage. Guided by the sound of knocking from beneath the fallen logs, the desperate signals of men still alive but running out of time and air. As the DJ spoke, the knocking sound on the radio became more insistent, no longer subtle or easily ignored. It seemed to be responding to his words, growing louder during certain parts of the story and fading during others, as if the rhythm itself was trying to communicate something beyond the reach of ordinary language. I found myself leaning forward in my seat, straining to hear every word while simultaneously trying to decode the pattern of the knocking, which had begun to vary in intensity and speed, sometimes rapid and urgent, other times slow and methodical. The rescue effort at the logging camp had lasted 6 days, The DJ continued, with the knocking from beneath the debris growing weaker each day until finally, on the morning of the 7th day, silence fell over the disaster site. When the rescuers finally cleared away enough timber to reach the trapped men, they found that all 17 had perished, but their bodies were arranged in a peculiar way, as if they had been trying to communicate with each other in their final hours, tapping messages back and forth through the darkness using pieces of wood and metal they had found in the wreckage. The radio signal suddenly became crystal clear, clearer than it had been all evening, and the knocking sound was now so prominent that it seemed to be coming not just from the speakers, but from the very air inside my cab. I glanced around nervously, checking my mirrors and scanning the instrument panel for any indication of mechanical problems. But everything appeared normal. The engine was running smoothly, the oil pressure was steady, and there were no warning lights to suggest that the sound was coming from my truck, rather than the radio broadcast. The DJ's voice had changed again, becoming more urgent and personal, as if he were speaking directly to me rather than to a general listening audience. He began describing the exact stretch of road I was currently traveling, mentioning landmarks I had passed just minutes earlier, curves and grades that he couldn't possibly know I was navigating unless he could somehow see me. The knocking sound was now keeping perfect time with my windshield wipers, and I realized with growing unease that it had been doing so for quite some time, synchronizing itself with the rhythms of my journey in a way that seemed far too deliberate to be coincidental. According to the radio, the site of the old logging camp was just ahead, marked by a historical sign that most drivers passed without noticing, especially at night and in bad weather. The DJ suggested that truckers traveling this route often reported strange experiences near this location, radios that picked up signals from decades past, CB chatter from drivers who had been dead for years, and most commonly, a knocking sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the eternal signal of men still trying to communicate across the boundary between life and death. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights illuminated a small brown sign beside the road, just as the DJ had predicted. I couldn't make out the words through the rain and darkness, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. The knocking sound was now so loud that it seemed to be coming from the trailer behind me, as if something were trapped inside the load of lumber, tapping desperately against the walls in a pattern that was almost like Morse code. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, a small gravel turnout that was probably used by maintenance crews during the day, but was now empty and dark except for the pale glow of my running lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The rain continued to fall steadily, drumming against the roof of my cab with a sound that was almost identical to the knocking from the radio. I turned up the volume trying to understand what the DJ was saying, but his voice had become distorted and fragmented, fading in and out like a distant station losing its signal to atmospheric interference. The knocking continued even when the DJ's voice disappeared completely, even when the music stopped and nothing but static filled the speakers. It was coming from all around me now, from the trailer, from the cab walls, from the very air itself. A desperate percussion that seemed to be trying to tell me something vitally important. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the rain, the cold drops immediately soaking through my jacket as I made my way back to check the trailer doors. The lumber load was secure, exactly as I had left it at the mill, but as I stood there in the darkness listening to the rain fall on the metal roof of the trailer, I could swear I heard the knocking sound continuing inside, muffled but persistent, as if 17 voices were still trying to communicate across nearly a century of silence, using the only language available to them in that space between worlds. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto Route 49, but the knocking followed me, keeping time with my heartbeat, with my breathing, with the rhythm of the road itself. The radio never did return to normal that night, and when I finally reached Boise the next morning and delivered my load of lumber to the construction site, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had transported more than just wood through those mountain passes. That somewhere in my trailer had been the echoes of men who died decades ago, but who had never quite learned how to stop. The cargo that wept. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving freight through the Midwest in winter is that the silence gets to you after a while. Miles and miles of nothing but snow-covered fields stretching toward the horizon, your headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers, and the steady drone of your diesel engine becoming a kind of mechanical lullaby that threatens to put you to sleep at the wheel. I'd been running this route between Chicago and Denver for nearly 15 years, and I thought I knew every sound my old Peterbilt could make. Every creak and groan and whistle that came with hauling 40,000 pounds of cargo across the heartland. But that night in February, somewhere between Des Moines and Grand Island, I started hearing something new. It began as just a whisper beneath the engine noise, so faint I almost convinced myself it was the wind finding its way through some loose seal in the cab. The weather had been brutal for the past 3 days, with temperatures dropping well below zero and a steady snowfall that turned the interstate into a white tunnel of swirling flakes. My wipers worked overtime, their rhythmic scraping adding another layer to the symphony of sounds that filled the cabin as I pushed through the storm. The load I was carrying was nothing special, at least according to the paperwork. Medical supplies bound for a hospital in Colorado, all properly sealed and documented. The dispatcher had mentioned it was priority freight, which explained the premium rate, but otherwise it seemed like routine cargo. The trailer had been preloaded when I picked it up from the warehouse in Chicago, and I hadn't given it much thought as I signed the manifest and pulled out into the bitter February night. That soft crying sound started about an hour past the Iowa border. At first, I reached over and turned down the radio, thinking maybe some distant station was bleeding through with a sad song or a dramatic radio play. But the music had been nothing but classic rock and trucker talk, and when I killed the volume completely, the sound persisted. It was definitely coming from behind me, from the direction of the trailer, a low and mournful weeping that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the road. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely outpost of neon and diesel fuel that sat like an island of light in the endless darkness. The crying stopped the moment I downshifted and began to break, vanishing so completely that I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on my mind. The fuel pumps hummed and clicked as I topped off my tanks, and I took the opportunity to walk around the trailer, checking the seals and inspecting the cargo doors. Everything looked normal. The locks were intact, the paperwork matched, and there were no signs of damage or tampering. A few other drivers huddled in the truck stop diner, nursing coffee and complaining about the weather, but none of them seemed to have heard anything unusual. I grabbed a thermos of coffee for myself and tried to shake off the uneasiness that had settled over me like a cold fog. Back on the road, the crying resumed within minutes of reaching highway speed. This time it was unmistakable, a soft sobbing that seemed to ebb and flow like breathing. I could hear it clearly over the engine noise, over the whistle of wind around the cab, over the scrape of the wipers against the windshield. It was the sound of someone in deep distress, someone frightened and alone and desperate for comfort. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But the sound seemed to wrap around me, filling the cab with an atmosphere of profound sadness. Miles passed in a blur of white and yellow lines, and the crying continued. Sometimes it would fade to almost nothing, just a whisper of anguish that I could barely detect beneath the other sounds of the truck. Other times it would swell in volume, becoming so clear and present that I found myself looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing in the trailer behind me. The sound had a quality that was difficult to describe, something that suggested not just sadness but a kind of desperate longing, as if whoever was making it was trying to communicate something important, but couldn't quite form the words. I tried the radio again, scanning through the static-filled channels until I found a late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena. The host's voice was calm and rational, a welcome contrast to the increasingly disturbing sounds coming from my cargo. But even with the radio turned up, I could still hear the crying underneath, persistent and heartbreaking and impossible to ignore. The storm began to worsen as I approached the Nebraska border, and the crying grew more intense with each passing mile. What had started as soft weeping now carried notes of panic, of someone trapped and terrified and running out of time. I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator, as if speed might somehow leave the sound behind, but it only seemed to make things worse. The crying became more frantic, more desperate, rising in pitch until it was almost a wail. That's when I started to notice the temperature changes. The cab heater had been running steadily all night, keeping the interior comfortable despite the brutal cold outside. But now I could feel cold spots forming in the air behind me, patches of frigid air that seemed to move and shift like invisible presences. The crying was coming from these cold zones, and as they drifted closer to my seat, the sound became clearer and more distinct. I could make out individual sobs, catch the rhythm of panicked breathing, even hear what sounded like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and ice crystals started forming on the inside of the windows. The engine temperature gauge held steady, showing that the mechanical systems were functioning normally, but the cab felt like a walk-in freezer. I cranked the heater to maximum, but it seemed to have no effect on the supernatural chill that was creeping through the truck like a living thing. The crying reached a crescendo as I crested a hill and saw the lights of Grand Island spread out below me. But instead of the relief I expected to feel at seeing civilization again, a wave of terror washed over me as I realized the voices were no longer confined to the trailer. They were in the cab with me now, surrounding me with their anguish and desperation. I could feel cold breath on the back of my neck, sense invisible figures pressing close to my seat, their ghostly presence so real I could almost reach out and touch them. The truck began to shudder and buck despite the steady pressure of my foot on the accelerator, as if some unseen force was fighting against our forward motion. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, trying to pull us toward the shoulder of the highway, toward the dark fields that stretched away into nothingness. The crying became a chorus of voices, dozens of them weeping and wailing and pleading in languages both familiar and strange. I fought to maintain control as the truck lurched and swayed, the trailer fishtailing on the icy road surface. In the mirrors, I could see shapes moving inside the cargo area, dark silhouettes that pressed against the walls and seemed to be trying to claw their way out. The temperature in the cab dropped even further, and my hands began to go numb on the steering wheel despite my heavy gloves. That's when I saw the exit sign for the Grand Island Truck Plaza, still 3 miles ahead but blazing like a beacon in the storm. I aimed for it with single-minded determination, ignoring the supernatural chaos that was tearing through my truck like a hurricane. The voices grew louder and more frantic as we approached the exit, as if they knew their time was running out. Cold hands seemed to clutch at my shoulders, trying to drag me backward into whatever nightmare realm they inhabited. I took the exit ramp faster than I should have, feeling the trailer swing wide as we rounded the curve. But the moment we left the main highway, the crying began to fade. By the time I pulled into the truck plaza and set the air brakes, the cab had returned to normal temperature and the voices had fallen silent. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of my mind wanted to dismiss it all as fatigue and imagination, but my hands were still shaking, and the memory of those cold, desperate voices seemed burned into my consciousness. Finally, I climbed down from the cab and walked back to inspect the trailer once more. The locks were still intact, the seals unbroken, but when I pressed my ear against the cargo doors, I could swear I heard the faintest whisper of movement from within. Not the crying anymore, but something like relieved sighs, as if whatever was in there had finally found some measure of peace. I delivered the load to Denver without further incident, though I never did learn exactly what was in those sealed containers. The receiving clerk seemed nervous and eager to get the cargo unloaded quickly, and I didn't ask any questions. Some knowledge comes with a price I'm not willing to pay. The shadow that drives the rig. From Jake Morrison. The first thing you learn about long-haul trucking is that the road has its own heartbeat. A steady rhythm that gets into your bones and stays there long after you've parked for the night. The second thing you learn is that not everything you see out there on those endless stretches of asphalt is meant for human eyes. I've been driving these highways for 23 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen chickens across this great country, and I thought I'd seen it all. But last month, somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow on a fog-shrouded Tuesday night, I discovered there are still mysteries out there that can shake a man's faith in what's real and what's not. The evening started ordinary enough, the kind of routine run I could drive with my eyes closed. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along smooth as silk, her 18 wheels eating up the miles while the CB crackled with the usual chatter between drivers. The load was light, just some computer equipment bound for Phoenix, and I was making good time despite the thick fog that had rolled in from the Pacific around sunset. That fog was something else, though. Dense and creamy white, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards on a good stretch. It moved across the landscape like something alive, pooling in the valleys and wrapping around the hills like ghostly fingers. I'd been driving in fog plenty of times before, so I wasn't particularly worried. Just dropped my speed down to a cautious 45 and kept my running lights blazing while the fog swirled and danced in my headlight beams. The radio was playing some old country tune, and I was nursing a thermos of coffee that was still warm from the truck stop in Bakersfield. Everything felt normal, routine even, until I started noticing the other truck. At first, it was just a pair of taillights in my mirrors, keeping pace about a quarter-mile back. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of drivers prefer to follow another rig in heavy fog rather than navigate blind. But as the miles rolled by, those lights never got closer, never fell back. Just maintained that exact same distance like they were tethered to my trailer by an invisible chain. The fog was playing tricks with the light too, making those red dots seem to pulse and fade, sometimes disappearing entirely only to reappear in the exact same spot moments later. Around mile marker 127, I tried raising whoever was back there on the CB. Channel 19 was quiet except for some static, so I switched to 17 and gave it a shot. Breaker 17, this is the Peterbilt eastbound at mile marker 127, looking for the driver behind me. Nothing but white noise answered back. That peculiar empty sound that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I tried a few more times, cycling through different channels, but got the same result each time. Either the driver wasn't monitoring, or there was something wrong with their radio. The fog began to thin as we climbed into the hills, revealing patches of star-filled sky and the dark silhouettes of Joshua trees standing sentinel along the roadside. That's when I got my first clear look at the truck behind me, and that's when the ordinary night started becoming something else entirely. In the brief moments when the fog parted, I could see it was an old Kenworth conventional, probably from the 70s, judging by the shape of the cab. Dark paint job, looked like it might have been blue or black, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. But here's the thing that made my coffee go cold in my cup. I couldn't make out any details beyond the basic outline. No chrome, no running lights except for those red tail lights, no license plate that I could see. It was like looking at the shadow of a truck rather than the truck itself. I've got sharp eyes, 20/20 vision even at 52 years old, but that Kenworth seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When my mirrors caught it in a clear patch, it looked more like a hole cut out of the night than an actual vehicle. The headlights that should have been blazing white in the fog were nowhere to be seen, as if the truck was running dark except for those persistent red dots that never wavered, never blinked, never deviated from their position. As we descended into the next valley, the fog closed in again like a living thing, and I lost sight of the mystery truck once more. But I could feel it back there, a presence that seemed to press against my consciousness with an almost physical weight. The hair on my arms was standing up, and I found myself checking the mirrors more frequently, searching for those red lights that had become both familiar and deeply unsettling. The radio began picking up strange interference, voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify, music that sounded like it was being played underwater, bursts of what might have been Morse code spelling out messages I couldn't decode. Then the engine started acting up. My caterpillar had been purring like a satisfied cat all evening, but now it began developing a subtle stutter, a hesitation in its rhythm that you feel more than hear. The tachometer needle was dancing slightly, and the oil pressure gauge was fluctuating in ways that made no mechanical sense. I downshifted and checked all my gauges twice, but everything appeared normal except for those minor irregularities that seemed to pulse in time, with the appearance and disappearance of those red lights behind me. Mile marker 134 came and went, then 135, and still that phantom Kenworth maintained its exact distance. I tried speeding up, pushing the Peterbilt to 60 despite the fog, but those lights stayed right where they'd been. I tried slowing down to 35, thinking maybe the driver would get impatient and pass me, but again, no change in position. It was as if the truck behind me wasn't bound by the same physical laws that governed my own rig, as if distance and speed were just suggestions it chose to ignore. The temperature gauge began climbing, not into the danger zone, but higher than it should have been on a cool, foggy night with a light load. I could hear the cooling fan cycling more frequently, and the exhaust note had developed a hollow quality that made it sound like the engine was working much harder than it actually was. Everything about my truck felt wrong, as if the presence behind me was somehow draining its vital energies, siphoning off power and performance through some invisible connection I couldn't understand or break. At mile marker 138, I made a decision. There was a rest area coming up, nothing fancy, just a pull-out with a couple of picnic tables and a phone booth left over from the days before cell towers covered every inch of highway. I'd pull in there, let the mystery truck pass, and maybe get a better look at it in the process. As I downshifted and activated my turn signal, I watched the mirrors carefully, expecting to see those red lights continue east as I exited the main highway. They didn't. As I pulled into the rest area and brought my rig to a stop, those lights slowed and followed me in, maintaining that same precise distance they'd kept for the past 40 miles. There was no sound of another engine, no hiss of air brakes, no crunch of gravel under heavy tires, just those two red dots hanging in the fog about 200 yards behind my trailer, glowing with a steady intensity that seemed to grow stronger as the night deepened around us. I sat there in my cab for 10 minutes, engine idling, watching those lights and waiting for something to happen. The fog swirled and eddied in the light from my headlamps, creating shapes that almost looked like faces, like hands reaching out of the mist. The radio had gone completely silent, not even static now, just a dead emptiness that made the night feel vast and hollow. My engine was running rough, missing on at least 2 cylinders, and the temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone despite the fact that I was sitting still with the cooling fan running continuously. That's when I realized the truth, the understanding hitting me like a physical blow that left me gasping and gripping the steering wheel with hands that had suddenly gone slick with sweat. Those weren't taillights I'd been watching in my mirrors. They were eyes. The shadow truck wasn't following me, it was feeding on me, drawing power from my rig and maybe from me too, growing stronger as my own vehicle grew weaker. The fog wasn't just weather, it was cover, camouflage for something that hunted the highways in the deep hours of the night, when drivers were alone and vulnerable and far from help. I dropped the Peterbilt into gear and punched the accelerator, spraying gravel as I fought to get back onto the highway. The engine was barely firing on half its cylinders now, but I pushed it as hard as I dared, calling on 23 years of experience to coax every bit of performance from machinery that was failing more quickly with each passing mile. In my mirrors, those red eyes were growing larger, brighter, as if my flight had triggered some predatory instinct that demanded pursuit. The voice that never grew up. From Marcus Chen, the CB radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., somewhere between the ghost towns of Nevada, where the desert stretches like a black ocean under starlight. I'd been running this route for 15 years, hauling electronics from Sacramento to Denver, and I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every dead zone where the radio goes silent. But this stretch of Highway 50, the one they call America's loneliest road, always made my skin crawl after midnight. My Peterbilt 389 hummed steady on the empty asphalt, headlights cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The radio had been quiet for the last hour, just the occasional burst of static and the distant chatter of drivers hundreds of miles away, their voices fading in and out like ghosts passing through dimensions. I kept the volume low, more for company than communication, watching the yellow lines disappear under my hood in their hypnotic rhythm. That's when I heard it the first time. "Mommy? Mommy, are you there?" The voice was small, fragile, like a child speaking through tears. It cut through the static with crystal clarity, so sudden and unexpected that I nearly swerved into the median. I grabbed the handset, checking the channel. 19, same as always. The voice came again, more plaintive this time. "Please, Mommy, I can't find you. It's so dark here." My throat tightened. Some kid must have gotten hold of a CB, maybe playing with Daddy's radio setup. It happened sometimes, though not often on the long-haul channels. I keyed the mic, keeping my voice gentle. "Hey there, little one. This is Big Bear on Channel 19. Where's your daddy?" Silence stretched for nearly a minute, filled only by the whisper of wind against my windows and the steady drone of my engine. Then the voice returned, and something in its tone made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. "Big Bear, are you my mommy's friend? She said she'd be on the radio. She said she'd come back for me." The innocence in those words hit me like a physical weight. I'd hauled freight through family emergencies, natural disasters, every kind of human tragedy you could imagine, but something about this felt different. Wrong somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "What's your name, kiddo? Can you tell me where you are?" "My name is Jamie. I'm in the truck with the red lights, but Mommy went away and she won't answer. She always answers when I call for her on the radio. Red lights. Emergency flashers, most likely. Some poor kid stranded with a broken-down rig, scared and alone while Mom tried to flag help or walked to find a phone." The thought made my chest ache. I'd been that scared kid once, waiting in Dad's cab while he fixed a blown tire on a dark highway. "Okay, Jamie, can you see any mile markers? Any signs that tell you where you are?" "I can see the numbers on the dashboard. They keep changing. 3284, now 3285. Mile markers." The kid was reading mile markers, which meant they were moving. That was impossible if the truck was broken down unless someone else was driving. Relief flooded through me. Mom must be behind the wheel. Maybe she'd just stepped away from the radio for a minute. "Is your mommy driving now, Jamie?" The pause stretched longer this time, filled with something I couldn't name. When the voice came back, it was smaller, more frightened. "Mommy's here, but she won't talk to me. Her eyes are closed and she feels cold. Big Bear, why won't she wake up?" Ice water ran through my veins. I pressed harder on the accelerator, scanning the darkness ahead for any sign of red lights, any indication of another vehicle. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, empty as a moonscape. "Jamie, listen to me very carefully. Is anyone else in the truck with you?" Just the man with the quiet voice. "He says he's taking me to see Mommy, but Mommy's right here and she won't wake up." My hands were shaking now. I grabbed the handset so hard my knuckles went white. Switching to the emergency channel. "Breaker, breaker. This is Big Bear on I-80 eastbound. We've got a possible kidnapping in progress. Child on CB channel 19 reporting." But the emergency channel was dead, nothing but static. I switched back to 19. "Jamie? Jamie, are you still there? Big Bear?" "The man says I shouldn't talk to strangers." "But you're not a stranger, are you? Mommy talks to Big Bear all the time on the radio." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I'd never spoken to anyone named Jamie before. Never had regular contact with any driver who mentioned a kid by that name. My CB handle was common enough, used by dozens of drivers across the country, but something in the way the child said it suggested familiarity, recognition. Jamie, what's your mommy's handle? What name does she use on the radio? Night Angel. She drives the pretty blue truck with the shiny wheels. She sings to me over the radio when I can't sleep. Night Angel, I knew that handle, had heard it dozens of times over the years. Sarah Kellerman, who ran a dedicated route between Reno and Salt Lake City. Mid-30s, divorced, with a daughter she sometimes mentioned during the long, lonely hours when drivers shared pieces of their lives through the static. I'd never met her face to face, but her voice had been a familiar comfort on countless midnight runs. Except Sarah's daughter's name wasn't Jamie. It was Jessica. And Jessica had died 3 years ago in a car accident while staying with her father. Big Bear, are you still my friend? The voice was fading now, distorted by growing static, but I could hear something else underneath it. Something that made every instinct I developed in 15 years of night driving scream warnings. I'm here, Jamie. Where are you now? What mile marker? 3317. The man is looking at me in the mirror. His eyes are funny. They don't blink. Big Bear, I want to go home. Mile marker 317. I was approaching 315, which meant they were just ahead of me, maybe 2 miles up the road. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, watching my speedometer climb past 80, past 90. The desert blurred past my windows, but there were no taillights ahead, no red flashers, nothing but endless empty road. Jamie, can you see any other trucks? Any lights behind you? I see lights, but they're far away. Like stars, but moving. The man says the lights are looking for us, but he knows where to hide. The static was getting worse, Jamie's voice breaking up into fragments. Mommy still won't wake up. Cold. So cold. Man says we're almost there. But where is there, Big Bear? Scared. Want my mommy. Want to go home? I crested a small rise and saw them. Taillights in the distance, red dots against the black horizon. A truck moving at normal highway speed. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening, just another driver hauling freight through the night. But as I drew closer, my blood chilled. It was Sarah's rig. The blue Kenworth with custom chrome wheels that she'd been so proud of. The same truck I'd seen photos of in driver magazines. The same truck she'd described during our brief radio conversations. But Sarah Kellerman had been found dead in a motel room outside Elko 6 months ago. Apparent heart attack. Her truck had been sold at auction. Jamie? Jamie, can you hear me? The radio crackled with interference, then cleared for a moment. Big Bear? I can see your lights now. The big white lights. Are you coming to help me? I was gaining on them, close enough now to make out details. The trailer was unmarked. No company logos or dot numbers visible. The cab swayed slightly as if the driver was having trouble staying in his lane. Yes, Jamie, I'm coming. Just hold on. I reached for my cell phone to call 911, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual out here, but the timing felt deliberate, malevolent. I was on my own. As I pulled into the left lane to pass, I could see into the truck's cab through the passenger side window. A small figure sat in the sleeper area, pale hands pressed against the glass. Dark hair, thin face, maybe 7 or 8 years old. And behind the wheel, a shape that might have been human but moved with mechanical precision. Hands gripping the steering wheel at perfect 10 and 2. The town that forgot the road. From Marcus. The weight of 22 tons of steel beams pressed against my trailer hitch as I downshifted into third gear. Watching the amber glow of headlights sweep across a weathered road sign that simply read, Millbrook, population 847. The numbers looked freshly painted, stark white against the green metal, but something about them seemed wrong in a way I couldn't quite place. It was past midnight on a Tuesday in October, and the autumn rain had been drumming against my windshield for the better part of 3 hours, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected my running lights in wavering streaks of red and orange. I'd been driving this route between Chicago and Denver for 8 years, hauling everything from construction materials to furniture shipments. and I thought I knew every truck stop, every diner, every wide spot on the road where a man could pull over and grab a cup of coffee or catch a few hours of sleep. But Millbrook was new to me, which struck me as odd because veteran drivers like myself don't usually stumble across towns we've never seen before, especially not on highways we've traveled hundreds of times. The rain was getting heavier, though, and my eyelids were starting to feel like sandpaper. So when I saw the warm yellow glow of streetlights cutting through the storm ahead, I decided to pull in and see if there was a place to park for the night. The first thing I noticed as I rolled down Main Street was how clean everything looked, almost pristine in that unsettling way that some small towns maintain, as if they exist in their own pocket of time separate from the rest of the world. Victorian houses lined both sides of the street, their wraparound porches adorned with hanging baskets of flowers that shouldn't have been blooming so late in the season. Warm light spilled from windows, and I could see the silhouettes of people moving around inside their homes, living their quiet evening lives. The downtown area consisted of maybe 6 or 7 storefronts, all of them painted in cheerful pastels with hand-lettered signs advertising things like homemade pie and fresh ground coffee. It was the kind of place that belonged on a postcard, the sort of town that city folks drive hours to visit on weekends when they want to pretend that places like this still exist in America. What I didn't see, however, was a single truck. Not one. In 8 years of long-haul driving, I'd never rolled through a town, no matter how small, without seeing at least a few semis parked somewhere. There's always a trucker grabbing a meal at the local diner, or catching some sleep behind a gas station, or making a delivery to the hardware store. We're part of the landscape of American towns, as common as stop signs and fire hydrants. But as I cruised slowly down Millbrook's main drag, my diesel engine rumbling like distant thunder in the quiet night, I realized I was completely alone in that regard. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner called Rosie's, its neon sign casting pink light across the wet pavement. The lot was big enough to accommodate my rig, though it felt strange parking in a space that seemed designed for pickup trucks and family sedans rather than 18-wheelers. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see a handful of people sitting at red vinyl booths, and a waitress in a powder blue uniform moving between tables with a coffee pot in her hand. It looked normal enough, inviting even, but as I shut down my engine and prepared to make a run for the front door, I noticed something that made me pause with my hand on the door handle. Every single car in the parking lot appeared to be from somewhere between the 1950s and 1970s, not restored classics or weekend hobby cars, but genuine working vehicles with the kind of honest wear that comes from daily use. A powder blue Buick Skylark sat next to a forest green Chevelle, which was parked beside a cream-colored Ford Galaxy with a small dent in the rear bumper. Their chrome bumpers gleamed under the streetlights, and their white wall tires showed the kind of tread patterns I hadn't seen since I was a kid riding in my grandfather's Oldsmobile. Even more puzzling, none of them showed the kind of rust and deterioration you'd expect from vehicles that age, especially in a part of the country where winter salt eats through metal like acid. The rain was coming down harder now, so I pulled my jacket over my head and jogged across the parking lot to the diner's front entrance. A small bell chimed as I pushed through the glass door, and the warm air that greeted me carried the comforting sense of coffee, bacon grease, and fresh-baked pie. The interior looked exactly like you'd expect a small-town diner to look, with checkered linoleum floors, chrome-edged tables, and a long counter lined with red stools. Norman Rockwell would have felt right at home. The waitress behind the counter looked up as I entered, and her smile seemed genuine enough, though there was something in her eyes that didn't quite match the warmth of her expression. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying brown hair pinned up in a style that reminded me of photographs from my mother's high school yearbook. "Evening, honey," she said, wiping down the counter with a dish rag. "Terrible night to be out driving. Coffee?" I slid onto one of the stools and nodded, grateful for the warmth and the prospect of caffeine. "Please, black." As she poured from a glass pot, I glanced around at the other customers. They were all dressed in clothing that seemed to come from an earlier era. The men in pressed slacks and button-down shirts, the women in simple dresses with cardigans draped over their shoulders. Their conversation was muted and polite, punctuated by the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic plates. It felt like stepping into a movie from the 1960s, complete and authentic in every detail. "Don't get many truck drivers through here," the waitress mentioned casually as she set my coffee cup on the counter. Her name tag read Betty in simple block letters. Most of the big rigs stick to the interstate. I took a sip of the coffee, which was surprisingly good, rich and hot without the bitter edge you usually get from a pot that's been sitting too long. "I've been driving this route for years," I told her, "but I've never noticed your town before. Must have just missed it somehow." Betty's smile flickered for just a moment like a fluorescent bulb with a loose connection. "Oh, we've been here a long time. Sometimes people just drive right past without seeing us. Depends on what they're looking for, I suppose." She refilled my cup without being asked, her movements practiced and efficient. "You planning to stay the night?" I nodded, pulling out my phone to check for messages from dispatch. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural areas, but when I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't just showing no bars, it was showing no carrier information at all, as if the cellular network simply didn't exist in this place. "Is there somewhere I can park my truck overnight? Maybe a truck stop or a rest area?" The diner had grown noticeably quieter, and I realized that several of the other customers were now looking in my direction, with expressions that seemed curious rather than hostile, but curious in the way that people might look at an exotic animal that had wandered into their living room. Betty glanced around the room before leaning closer to me across the counter, lowering her voice to just above a whisper. "There's a field just outside of town where you can park," she said. "Take Main Street east until you see the old Miller farm. But honey, you might want to think about moving on in the morning. Millbrook's a nice place, but it's not really set up for folks like you. We don't get truck traffic here, and there's a reason for that." Something in her tone made the hair on my arm stand up, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The coffee suddenly tasted different, though it was the same coffee I'd been drinking for the past 10 minutes. I left a $5 bill on the counter, which seemed to surprise Betty more than it should have, and made my way back out into the rain. The Miller farm turned out to be exactly where she'd said it would be. A gravel entrance leading to a flat field that looked like it might have been used for parking during county fairs or community events. I pulled my rig off the road and shut down for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I found myself thinking about Betty's warning, about the strange absence of any other commercial vehicles, about the way the townspeople had stared at me as if I were something that didn't belong in their world. The frequency of lost souls. From Marcus Chen. "The thing about long hauls is that the radio becomes your best friend, your confessor, and sometimes your only lifeline to sanity. I've been running freight between Portland and Denver for 8 years now, driving the same routes through the Cascade Passes and across the high desert plateaus, and I thought I knew every station that could reach my cab through those mountains. Classical on 91.5 until you hit the valley, country on 103.7 that fades to static somewhere past Bend, and that late-night talk show on AM 680 that keeps you company through the loneliest stretches. My Kenworth's radio had been my faithful companion through countless nights, its amber glow steady as a lighthouse beacon across the dashboard. But last Tuesday, something changed on Highway 26, something that still makes me check my mirrors more often than I should. I was hauling a load of electronics westbound, making good time despite the October rain that had been falling steadily since I left the Dow. The wipers kept their rhythmic beat against the windshield while droplets caught the light from oncoming trucks like scattered diamonds. It was one of those Pacific Northwest nights where the darkness feels heavy and complete, pressing against the cab windows with an almost physical weight. I had been listening to a late-night jazz program, the saxophone notes floating through the cab like smoke, when I noticed something odd about the mile markers. I knew this stretch of road better than the lines on my palm, but the numbers seemed wrong somehow, like they were counting backward or skipping intervals. The green reflective signs caught my headlights at irregular intervals, and when I tried to focus on the numbers, they seemed to blur just at the edge of recognition. I blamed it on fatigue and the hypnotic effect of rain on asphalt. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was different about this familiar route. The radio began to drift first, the jazz program fading into static that sounded almost like whispers if you listened too carefully. I reached for the tuner, expecting to find the usual suspects across the dial, but instead discovered stations that shouldn't have existed. At 88.1, a children's choir was singing what sounded like nursery rhymes, but the words were wrong, twisted into something that made my skin crawl despite the innocent melody. The voices were too perfect, too synchronized, like they had been recorded in a place where children never laughed or played, only sang their strange songs into the darkness. At 94.7, a weather report droned on about conditions I didn't recognize, mentioning towns with names that felt familiar but wrong, as if someone had taken real places and shifted them slightly out of focus. The meteorologist spoke of fog rolling in from lakes that didn't exist and temperature drops in valleys I had never heard of. Yet somehow his voice carried the authority of years of broadcast experience. When he mentioned overnight lows in areas that sounded almost like places I knew, I found myself checking the GPS, but the screen showed only my familiar route, unchanged and unremarkable. The most unsettling was 101.3, where a talk show host interviewed guests about their experiences with what he called road displacement events. The callers spoke in measured tones about highways that led to the wrong destinations, about taking familiar exits and finding themselves in towns that existed only in their periphery, places that vanished when you tried to look at them directly. One caller, a woman with a voice like autumn leaves, described driving the same route for 20 years until one night it delivered her to a gas station that had burned down in her childhood, fully operational and staffed by people she almost remembered. I tried to change the station, to find something normal and grounding, but the dial seemed to have a life of its own. Each frequency carried voices that spoke of journeys that never ended properly, of routes that had developed their own consciousness and intentions. A preacher on AM 1240 delivered a sermon about roads that remembered the travelers they had carried, about asphalt that absorbed not just the weight of wheels but the dreams and fears of those who passed over it. His voice rose and fell with evangelical fervor as he described highways that had become repositories of human longing, stretching across the landscape like neural pathways in some vast, sleeping mind. The rain began to fall harder, and I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle for what felt like hours, though my logbook showed only 40 minutes had passed since my last entry. The road ahead curved and straightened in patterns that felt both familiar and foreign, like looking at your own reflection in a funhouse mirror. The white lines seemed to pulse slightly in my peripheral vision, and the rumble strips sang a different song when my tires crossed them, a melody that almost matched the strange lullaby still playing from one of the radio stations. On 97.9, a DJ with a voice like velvet played what he called songs for the eternally traveling, melodies that seemed to capture the loneliness of empty highways and the romance of destinations that remained always just beyond the horizon. Between songs, he spoke directly to drivers like me, acknowledging our presence on roads that most people only saw in daylight, roads that revealed their true nature only to those who traveled them in the deep hours of the night. He knew things about trucking that only someone who had lived it could know. Yet his voice carried an otherworldly quality, as if he were broadcasting from a place that existed between the real world and the landscape of dreams. The GPS began to show my location as a slowly pulsing dot on a road that appeared to stretch infinitely in both directions, with no exits or intersections marked ahead or behind. When I tried to zoom out to see the larger context, the map became increasingly abstract, showing only the thin line of my route against a backdrop of shifting gray. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, though I remembered being close to half when this journey began. and the odometer seemed to be counting miles at a rate that didn't match my steady speed. As I crested what should have been a familiar hill, the radio stations began to overlap, their signals bleeding into each other until the cab filled with a symphony of voices all speaking or singing about the same theme. Roads that chose their own destinations, journeys that continued long after the driver thought they had arrived, and the strange comfort of traveling forever through landscapes that existed only for those who truly belonged to the highway. The children's choir harmonized with the talk show host, while the preacher's sermon provided a rhythmic foundation for the DJ's smooth commentary about the eternal nature of the American road. Ahead, I saw lights that might have been a truck stop or might have been something else entirely. The neon signs advertised familiar services, fuel and food and rest. But the color seemed wrong, too bright and too saturated for the rainy night. As I drew closer, I could see people moving around the pumps and walking to and from the building, but their movements had a dreamlike quality, too smooth and purposeful, as if they were actors playing roles they had performed countless times before. The radio voices reached a crescendo as I approached the lights, all speaking in unison now about the choice that every long-haul driver eventually faces. The choice between the world of destinations and deadlines, and the world of endless roads that lead everywhere and nowhere, where the journey itself becomes the only destination that matters. The children sang about highways that stretched beyond the edges of maps, while the preacher blessed those who chose to keep driving into the infinite night. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator, watching the mysterious truck stop slide past my windows like a mirage. In the mirrors, I saw it fade into the darkness as if it had never existed, while the radio slowly returned to normal programming. The jazz came back first, then the familiar crackle of AM static, and finally the comforting voice of the late-night talk show host, discussing ordinary topics with ordinary callers about ordinary concerns. When I reached Portland 6 hours later, my logbook showed that I had made the trip in normal time, with normal fuel consumption along my familiar route. But sometimes late at night when the rain falls on Highway 26, I find myself scanning the radio dial for those strange stations, wondering if that road is still out there somewhere, waiting patiently for drivers who are ready for a different kind of journey. The frequency numbers have faded from my memory, but I know I would recognize the voices if I heard them again, calling to those of us who understand that some roads lead to places that can't be found on any map, only discovered by those brave enough to keep driving when the familiar world falls away into static and dreams. The Last Supper special. From Marcus, the rain had been my only companion for the better part of 300 miles, drumming its relentless rhythm against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I pushed through the Wyoming darkness. The wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, their steady thrum mixing with the deep rumble of the diesel engine that had been my faithful partner for nearly 2 decades on these endless highways. It was past midnight when the neon glow first pierced through the curtain of rain ahead, a beacon of warmth and promise that made me ease off the accelerator and squint through the storm. Maggie's Diner, the sign read in faded red letters, with half the bulbs either burned out or flickering with that particular nervous energy that comes from too many years fighting the elements. The building itself was a classic aluminum-sided affair, the kind that sprouted up along truck routes in the 50s and had been weathering storms ever since. Steam rose from what I assumed was a kitchen vent, and through the rain-streaked windows I could make out the warm amber glow of interior lights. My stomach growled with a hunger I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment, reminding me that my last meal had been a stale sandwich from a gas station somewhere outside Cheyenne. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single sedan that had seen better decades, its primer-spotted hood collecting rainwater in small puddles where the metal had begun to sag. I maneuvered my rig toward the far end of the lot, away from the building, following the unwritten code of the road that keeps the big trucks from blocking the view for smaller vehicles. The air brakes hissed their familiar sigh as I brought the Peterbilt to rest, and I sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, listening to the rain pattering against the cab and the engine ticking as it began to cool. Something about the place felt different as I stepped down from the cab, pulling my jacket tight against the chill. The rain was cold enough to make me wonder if it might turn to sleet before morning, and each drop that found its way past my collar sent a small shiver down my spine. The neon sign buzzed overhead with an electrical hum that seemed almost musical, cycling through its pattern of illumination in a way that cast shifting shadows across the wet asphalt. As I approached the front door, I noticed that the windows were fogged with condensation, making it impossible to see clearly inside despite the warm light that beckoned from within. The bell above the door gave a tired chime as I pushed inside, and I was immediately enveloped by the familiar warmth and aroma of a working kitchen. Coffee, bacon grease, and something else I couldn't quite identify mingled in the air, creating that particular perfume that belongs solely to late-night diners. The interior was exactly what I had expected. A long counter with red vinyl stools that had been patched and repatched over the years, booths along the windows with matching upholstery, and a checkerboard floor that had been mopped so many times the pattern had begun to fade in the high-traffic areas. What struck me as odd, however, was the occupancy. Despite the welcoming atmosphere and the obvious signs of a functioning establishment, I appeared to be the only customer. The lone sedan in the parking lot belonged to someone, but the diner held only empty seats and the lingering warmth of recent occupancy, as if other patrons had just stepped out moments before my arrival. A cup of coffee sat steaming at the counter, cream still swirling in lazy spirals, and a newspaper lay folded beside it with today's date printed clearly across the top. "Welcome to Maggie's." "Han," came a voice from behind the serving counter, and I turned to see a woman emerge from what must have been the kitchen. She appeared to be in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of comfortable efficiency that comes from decades of serving food to hungry travelers. Her smile seemed genuine enough, though something in her eyes held a quality I couldn't quite define, a distance that made me think of someone looking at the world from very far away. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a cup before I had a chance to respond. "You look like you could use something hot after driving through this weather." The coffee was dark and strong when she poured it, steam rising in delicate tendrils that caught the overhead light. I wrapped my hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth, and nodded my appreciation. "Thank you kindly," I said, settling onto one of the counter stools. "Quite a storm out there." I was beginning to think I might have to ride it out in the cab when I saw your sign. The woman, who I assumed must be Maggie herself, smiled and wiped down the counter with practiced motions, though it appeared to be spotless already. "We're always open for folks who need us," she said, and there was something in the way she phrased it that made me look at her more carefully. "Are you hungry? We've got something special tonight." She gestured toward a chalkboard menu mounted behind the counter, and I turned to read what was written there in neat, flowing script. What I saw made me pause with the coffee cup halfway to my lips. Instead of the usual diner fare I had expected, burgers, meatloaf, pie, and the dozen other staples that fill the menus of places like this, there was only a single item listed. "The Last Supper Special," it read, with no description or price listed below. I stared at the board for a long moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust or for additional items to become visible. But the chalkboard remained steadfastly minimal in its offerings. That's quite a name for a dish," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "What exactly does the special include?" Maggie's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her expression. A subtle change that reminded me of clouds passing over the moon. "Oh, it's different for everyone," she replied, her voice maintaining that same warm hospitality while somehow becoming more distant. "We like to cater to individual tastes. What would you say you're hungry for, really hungry for, deep down?" The question struck me as oddly personal for a diner conversation, and I found myself struggling to formulate an answer that made sense. "I suppose just a good hot meal," I said finally. Maybe a burger and fries, something filling after a long day on the road. But even as I spoke, I realized that wasn't quite true. There was something else I was hungry for, something that had been gnawing at me for months as I traveled these empty highways. A sense of connection, perhaps, or meaning, or simply the feeling that I was moving towards something rather than just moving. "The Last Supper special it is," Maggie said, making a note on an order pad despite the fact that I hadn't actually agreed to anything. "It'll be ready shortly. Why don't you relax and finish your coffee?" She disappeared back into the kitchen before I could protest, leaving me alone in the dining room with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the continued drumming of rain against the windows. As I sat there, I became increasingly aware of small details that hadn't registered during my initial survey of the place. The newspaper beside the abandoned coffee cup was folded to the obituary section, and though I couldn't read the individual notices from my position, I could see that the entire page was filled with death announcements. The clock on the wall above the counter had stopped at 11:58, its hands frozen just 2 minutes before midnight. Most unsettling of all, I began to notice that the shadows in the room seemed to move independently of their sources, shifting and flowing in my peripheral vision in ways that defied the steady overhead lighting. The sound of sizzling from the kitchen grew louder, accompanied by aromas that were both familiar and strangely foreign. There was the scent of cooking meat, certainly, but underneath it lurked something else, something that reminded me of autumn leaves and old books, of churches and hospital corridors. I found myself thinking about my ex-wife, whom I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and my daughter, who had stopped returning my calls after I missed her graduation to make a delivery deadline. The loneliness that I usually kept carefully contained behind layers of routine and determination began to seep through my mental barriers like water through a failing dam. "Order up," Maggie called from the kitchen, though it seemed far too soon for any meal to have been prepared. When she emerged carrying a plate, I was surprised to see that it contained exactly what I had requested: a hamburger and fries that looked perfectly ordinary and smelled absolutely delicious. She set it before me with the same warm smile, along with a fresh napkin and silverware wrapped in a paper sleeve. "Enjoy," she said simply, and retreated to the far end of the counter, where she began wiping down surfaces that already gleamed with cleanliness. The watchers in the mist. From Marcus, you know how fog can play tricks on your mind when you're hauling freight through the mountains at 3 in the morning. I've been driving these routes for 15 years, seen plenty of weather roll in from the Pacific and settle into the valleys like milk poured into a bowl. But what happened to me last Tuesday night on Highway 101 north of Eureka, that wasn't any ordinary fog bank. And those weren't tricks my tired eyes were playing on me. I was running a load of lumber from the mills down in Fortuna up to Crescent City. Nothing unusual about that except for the timing. My dispatcher had called that afternoon saying the delivery window got moved up. Something about a construction crew starting early to beat some incoming storm system. So there I was, climbing through the redwood country in my Peterbilt 379, the diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby while my headlights carved through the darkness between those ancient trees. The fog started appearing around midnight, just wisps at first, curling up from the creek beds and rolling across the asphalt like ghostly fingers. I'd driven through plenty of coastal fog before, knew how it could thicken without warning and turn a familiar highway into something alien and disorienting. I downshifted and slowed my speed, letting the engine brake help control my descent into the valleys where the mist was gathering thickest. By the time I reached the long grade that winds down toward the Klamath River, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. My running lights reflected back at me from the wall of gray-white vapor, creating an almost hypnotic pattern that made it hard to judge distance and speed. I kept one hand steady on the wheel and reached for my CB radio to check if any other drivers were dealing with similar conditions. That's when I first noticed something odd about this particular fog bank. Usually when you're driving through heavy mist, Your headlights create a cone of illumination that fades gradually into the gray. But this fog seemed to have depth to it, layers that shifted and moved independent of any wind. And there were these spots, scattered throughout the vapor that seemed to catch and reflect my headlight. Beams more intensely than the surrounding mist. First I figured it was just moisture condensing on my windshield, creating patterns that looked like reflective points in the distance. I hit the wipers and cleared away the accumulation, but those bright spots remained, scattered through the fog like stars in a cloudy sky. They appeared to be roughly circular, each about the size of a quarter held at arm's length, and they had this peculiar quality of seeming to track my movement as I navigated the winding road. I tried raising another trucker on the CB, keying the mic and calling out for any drivers who might be dealing with similar conditions. The radio crackled with static, but underneath that electronic noise I could hear what sounded almost like whispers, too faint and distorted to make out any actual words. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but that strange whispering seemed to permeate every frequency. The reflective spots in the fog were becoming more numerous as I continued my descent toward the river crossing. They appeared at different distances from my truck, some seeming close enough to touch while others glowed faintly far back in the mist. What disturbed me most was how they seemed to maintain their positions relative to my truck as I moved, as if they were somehow anchored in the fog and following my progress down the mountain. I pulled my rig over to the shoulder and set the parking brake, letting the engine idle while I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The fog pressed against my windows like something alive, and those circular points of light continued their strange dance in the vapor around my truck. I rolled down my driver's side window and stuck my head out, hoping to get a clearer view of whatever was causing the reflections. The mist felt thick and clammy against my face, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite identify, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers that had been left too long in standing water. And in that moment when I leaned out into the fog, I realized that those reflective points weren't reflecting my headlights at all. They were generating their own soft phosphorescent glow, each one pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me unpleasantly of a slow heartbeat. But it was when one of those glowing circles drifted close enough for me to see it clearly that my blood turned to ice water in my veins. What I had taken for some kind of natural phenomenon was actually an eye, complete with iris and pupil, floating in the mist like a jellyfish drifting through dark water. The pupil contracted as it came within range of my headlight beam, and I swear the thing focused directly on me with an intelligence that was definitely not human. I jerked my head back into the cab and rolled up the window, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. The fog outside was filled with eyes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all floating at different levels and distances, all turning their attention toward my truck with that same unsettling awareness. They blinked in sequences that seemed almost like communication, creating patterns of light and darkness throughout the mist. I released the parking brake and eased back onto the highway, desperate to get through this nightmare and reach clear air on the other side of the valley. But as I drove, the eyes followed, pressing closer to my truck and peering through my windows with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some were large and dark, others small and bright, and they came in colors I had never seen in any living creature. Deep purples and electric blues and shades of green that seemed to glow from within. The whispers on my CB radio were getting louder and more distinct, resolving into what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. All sibilant consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to match the rhythmic blinking of the eyes outside. My engine began to sputter and miss as if the fog was somehow interfering with the combustion process, and several of my dashboard lights started flickering in patterns that eerily mirrored the pulsing of those watching orbs. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig as fast as I dared through the limited visibility, following the yellow center line like a lifeline, while the eyes pressed closer and closer to my cab. Some of them were so near now that I could see they had no visible means of support, just floating in the mist like grotesque balloons, their pupils dilating and contracting as they studied me with predatory interest. The fog began to take on a reddish tint in my mirrors, and I realized that the eyes behind me were changing color, shifting from their previous cool blues and greens to angry oranges and deep crimsons. The whispers on the radio became more agitated, rising in pitch and tempo until they sounded almost like the chattering of disturbed birds. My engine was running rough now, coughing and backfiring as if something in the mist was choking off its air supply. Just when I thought my truck might stall completely, leaving me stranded in that nightmare fog, I saw a faint glow ahead that looked different from the phosphorescent eyes. It was the steady white light of sodium vapor lamps marking the Klamath River Bridge, and I gunned my engine with everything it had left, racing toward that beacon of normalcy while the eyes in the fog seemed to grow more frantic and aggressive. The moment my front bumper crossed onto the bridge deck, the fog fell away as if it had hit an invisible wall. I looked back through my mirrors and saw the mist roiling and churning at the bridge approach like an angry ocean held back by some unseen barrier. The eyes were still there, floating in the vapor, but they seemed unable or unwilling to follow me across the water. I didn't stop until I reached the truck stop in Crescent City, where I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with my engine running, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination, brought on by fatigue and too much coffee. But when I called my dispatcher to report the delivery complete, he told me something that made my blood run cold all over. Again, 3 other drivers had called in that night reporting mechanical problems and strange weather conditions on Highway 101 between Eureka and Crescent City. All of them mentioned unusual fog and visibility issues, and 2 of them swore they had seen things in the mist that couldn't be natural. One driver, a guy named Peterson who I'd known for years, had abandoned his rig at the bridge and caught a ride back to town with another trucker, claiming he would never drive that route again. I still run freight through the Redwood country, but I plan my trips to avoid that particular stretch of highway during the pre-dawn hours. And sometimes when I'm driving through heavy fog anywhere along the coast, I catch myself checking my mirrors more often than usual, watching for any sign of those phosphorescent circles that might be watching me right back. The freezer burns of Interstate 80. From Marcus, I've been hauling refrigerated cargo for nearly 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Broken thermostats in July heat, spoiled loads worth more than my house, and enough mechanical failures to fill a graveyard of chrome and steel. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during that 3-day run from Portland to Chicago last November. The load was simple enough: frozen seafood bound for a chain of high-end restaurants. The dispatcher at Cascade Freight handed me the paperwork with his usual grunt, barely looking up from his coffee-stained clipboard. The reefer unit was humming along at a steady -10 degrees when I fired up my Peterbilt and rolled out into the gray Oregon drizzle. Everything seemed normal as I merged onto Interstate 84, the familiar weight of 40,000 pounds of cargo settling behind me like an old friend. The first sign something was wrong came somewhere between Pendleton and La Grande, when I noticed my breath fogging up inside the cab. Now I keep my sleeper heated to a comfortable 70 degrees. It's one of the few luxuries I allow myself on these long hauls. But as I crested the Blue Mountains, I found myself reaching for the thermostat, cranking it up to 75, then 80. The digital readout insisted the heat was working perfectly, yet I could feel the cold seeping into my bones like water through cracked concrete. By the time I reached Boise for my mandatory rest break, frost was forming on the inside of my windshield despite the defroster running full blast. I pulled into a truck stop and grabbed a coffee that steamed like a locomotive in the frigid cab air. The other drivers in the diner looked at me funny when I kept my heavy jacket zipped up to my chin, nursing that coffee like it was liquid salvation while the November night pressed against the windows. Back on the road, the cold seemed to intensify with each passing mile. My fingers went numb on the steering wheel despite my insulated gloves, and I had to keep flexing them to maintain my grip. The engine temperature gauge read normal. The cabin heater controls showed maximum output. Yet the cold continued its relentless invasion. It wasn't the dry, sharp cold of winter air. This was different, deeper somehow. Like the ancient chill that rises from underground caves or abandoned mine shafts. Somewhere in the middle of Wyoming, with nothing but sagebrush and darkness stretching to the horizon, I noticed the frost patterns spreading across my side windows weren't random. They formed delicate, intricate designs that seemed almost deliberate. Spirals and fractals that reminded me of the patterns you see in snowflakes under a magnifying glass. But these were larger, more complex, and as I studied them in the glow of my dashboard lights, I could swear they were moving, growing, reshaping themselves as I watched. The radio crackled with the usual trucker chatter, but the voices seemed muffled and distant, as if the cold was somehow dampening the sound waves. I tried calling out on Channel 19, asking about road conditions ahead, but my words came out in visible puffs of vapor that obscured my view of the instrument panel. The few responses I received were garbled, filled with static that sounded almost like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. During my next mandatory rest period at a truck stop outside Cheyenne, I walked back to check on the reefer unit, my boots crunching on gravel that glittered with an unseasonable layer of frost. The refrigeration controls showed everything operating normally, minus 10 degrees, just as it should be. But when I placed my hand on the insulated trailer wall, the metal was so cold it burned my palm through my work gloves. More disturbing was the way the cold seemed to be bleeding through the insulation, creating patches of ice on the exterior that expanded outward like slow-motion explosions frozen in time. Other truckers gave my rig a wide berth in the parking lot, though I couldn't blame them. A thin layer of ice covered my entire truck from cab to trailer, and frost hung from every edge and surface like translucent Spanish moss. The fuel in my saddle tanks was so cold it took 3 tries to get the engine started again, and when it finally caught, the exhaust from my stacks crystallized instantly in the air, creating ghostly clouds that lingered long after I'd pulled back onto the interstate. The cold was no longer just physical. It was seeping into my thoughts, slowing them down like honey in winter. My reactions became sluggish, my vision blurred around the edges, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to simply pull over and sleep, even though some primitive part of my brain warned me that sleep might be permanent. The heater controls had long since ceased to respond, frozen solid in their housings, and ice began forming on the interior surfaces of the cab itself. Nebraska passed in a blur of white, not snow, but the thick frost that coated my windshield despite the wipers running continuously. I could barely see the road through the ice, navigating more by the rumble strips and the occasional gleam of reflectors than by actual sight. The GPS screen flickered and died, its liquid crystal display apparently unable to function in the supernatural cold that had invaded every inch of my truck. It was somewhere near Omaha, in the dead hours before dawn, when I finally understood what was happening. The frost patterns on my windows had grown more elaborate, more purposeful, and in their crystalline architecture I began to recognize shapes. Human figures locked in eternal frozen dance, faces contorted in silent screams, hands reaching out as if grasping for warmth that would never come. These weren't random ice formations. They were memories, impressions left behind by something that had experienced cold beyond imagination. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My cargo wasn't just frozen seafood. Somewhere in those thousands of packages, hidden among the boxes of salmon and crab, was something else. Something that carried winter in its very essence and was gradually transforming my entire truck into an extension of whatever frozen hell it had come from. The cold wasn't leaking from a broken refrigeration unit. It was emanating from whatever lay concealed in my trailer, spreading its influence through steel and insulation as if they were nothing more than tissue paper. My hands were so numb I could barely feel the steering wheel, and my feet had lost all sensation inside my boots. Each breath sent daggers of pain through my lungs, and I knew with terrible clarity that I had perhaps 30 minutes before hypothermia claimed me completely. The irony wasn't lost on me, dying of cold while traveling through states where the outside temperature hovered in the 40s. Desperate, I began looking for any place to stop, any refuge from the killing cold that had invaded my truck. But every exit I passed seemed to lead into darkness, and the few lights I could see through the frost-covered windshield appeared dim and distant, as if the cold was somehow bending light itself away from my truck. The radio had gone completely silent, and I realized that other vehicles on the interstate were changing lanes to avoid me, their drivers perhaps sensing something fundamentally wrong with my rig dawn was breaking somewhere beyond the wall of ice that had become my windshield when I finally saw salvation. A truck stop with every light blazing, the brilliant illumination cutting through the supernatural gloom that surrounded my Peterbilt like a beacon. I nursed the truck into the parking lot, my frozen fingers barely able to work the air brakes, and stumbled from the cab into air that felt like a tropical breeze despite the November chill. Behind me, my truck sat like a monument to winter itself, every surface coated in ice so thick it obscured the shape of the vehicle beneath. Other drivers gathered at a respectful distance, their voices low and worried as they discussed what they were seeing. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the cargo that was still slowly transforming everything around it, but my throat was so cold I could barely whisper. The state police arrived within the hour, followed by hazmat teams and officials I couldn't identify. They wouldn't let me approach my truck, wouldn't let me explain about the cargo or the impossible cold that had nearly claimed my life. Instead, they loaded the entire rig onto a specialized trailer and hauled it away. Destination unknown. The paperwork they made me sign was so heavily redacted that most pages were more black ink than text. That was 6 months ago, and I still haven't received my final paycheck from that run. Cascade Freight claims no knowledge of the cargo I was hauling, insisting their records show nothing but a routine shipment of frozen fish. But sometimes on the coldest nights I wake up in my sleeper with my breath fogging the air, and I can feel that same supernatural chill creeping in around the edges of my current truck. I've changed companies twice since then, but the cold seems to follow me. A reminder that some cargo should never be transported, and some destinations are better left unreached.